speaker for the opposition is Mr. John Prasifka.
Yes, so before we begin, I just have a brief announcement to make. If you order this book within the next 30 minutes, you're going to get a lovely set of wine glasses for the price of 12. So it's a really good deal, so I think you should. Okay, so basically, when I first saw this motion, I saw it as a really good excuse to just go on some erroneous tangents about mathematics. So I'm going to do that a lot. I'm sorry, but I think it's really cool and I'm going to enjoy it. I'm going to try and tie it into motion a little bit. So firstly, I'm just going to talk about one thing that Will said. From what I can gather, right, most of what Will brought to you were just these sort of strange examples in which faith was bad, and in which science and faith came interact in a bad way that we all think were bad. So I'm just going to bring an equally irrelevant but significantly more interesting mathematical counterexample. What we see in early history, right, what we see is that the center of the mathematical universe, or where all the great maths is being done, transferred into the Middle East and all throughout there. Why? Because there was such a because Islam was such a strict religion in terms of everyone had to pray towards Mecca, Ramadan started at a specific time or whatever, which required mathematics to advance so much. So that's an example of where religion and science have coincided and their interests have become at one, and how that furthers both, and why that's a really good thing. I just thought it was interesting. So anyway, what I'm basically going to talk about is, firstly I'm going to talk about the relationship between science and faith. I'm going to talk about why science and faith kind of operate in separate spheres, so to speak. So our current understanding of science isn't really one which overrides faith, and isn't one which comes in contact with it necessarily, and why they can coexist quite well. Right? So what I would say is that basically the claim that God exists is the claim that there exists something that is amaterial, something that exists outside of scientific, of the material world as we perceive it, right? So what I'd say is that science can never therefore prove or disprove it, right? If you look at, like Einstein himself said that as a scientist, one ought to be ambivalent to the idea of theism, right? As a scientist, you shouldn't derive your view through science, because science is so taken aback from the idea of faith and the idea of God itself, right? So I think that those things are necessarily distinct. So one can never really override the other because they occupy sort of separate spheres, so to speak. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how science and how placing a limit on science, right? So a lot of the speakers have talked a lot about how we can know everything and how science is so great because it can keep progressing and so on. What I'd say is that there are numerous examples in which we placed a limit on science, and that has been incredibly powerful and incredibly useful and interesting mathematically. So firstly, right, what I'd say is, one of the great problems that we saw in sort of the Middle Ages was this idea of how you could solve cubic equations, right? Which I won't get into the details. So basically, they figured out how you could solve it. Then they figured out that same method would work for more difficult quadratic equations. And then when they got to cubic equations, they realized that the method didn't work anymore. And they couldn't do that and have to find some other way. And that was seen at the time as being horrible and as a massive defeat to scientific and reasonable ends. But the reality was that this is an incredible moment for reason, to show that there are things that we can't know, there are things that we can't do, how we have found the limit of our reason and of our understanding, and why this is really good. No thanks. And then furthermore, what I don't understand is this whole premise by which there's this inalienable, that's definitely not the word I was looking for. So there's this kind of untouchable idea that reason is something that we should always be looking towards, and why irrationality is something that we should be terrified of. When the reality is, if you want to try and build any kind of structure by which you can prove that rationality actually makes sense, or the idea of logical proof, or logic as we perceive it, actually makes sense, it's impossible to do that within the framework of logic, right? Because you always have to define a set of axioms which you are going to assume before, I think Professor Berman was talking about a lot, how it's always going to be regressive, because you're always going to be referencing what came before, and you can never actually establish something that you truly know. Right? And this is proven by Kurt Gödel, the idea that that there are certain things which are true but can't be proven. There are things outside of this idea of reason. And that's really cool and really useful and really interesting. So I think that, that's pretty good. Yeah.
Okay, regardless of whether or not logical thought is true, do you not agree that logical thought can improve the quality of life of people far more?
I'm not saying that science is bad. I'm not saying that scientific advancement hasn't helped people a lot. I think science is really good. I just think that at the point at which I'm going to talk about later, at the point at which any view overrides all other views, that becomes problematic. So now I'm going to talk briefly about some issues that I have with science generally. Right? Firstly, it's this idea that so it's all about what we can prove, experimentally. And that means that ultimately, right, science has always been wrong. all the ideas that we had in the past, we now laugh at as being like crazy, because ultimately science has progressed so much. And obviously we can stand here now and say, well, that's what science is. Science progresses, science asks questions of itself. But as individuals living in that society that believed things that were crazy, that we now see as being crazy, they were victims of that idea, because we couldn't prove, because we didn't have the technology to show that certain things were untrue. We didn't have the technology to verify certain principles. And then that becomes like massively problematic. So then basically, I'm going to move on then to this idea of how science and faith can coexist well, and why that's really good. Because what I think is, what we've seen a lot of examples in which faith has been shown to be really bad. Faith has been shown to undermine, to just massive problems with certain religions and what they've done, and how their irrationality has been bad. But equally, right, there are loads of experiments that show that when a scientist tells people to do stuff that is bad, they will do it because a scientist told them to. So any kind of mindless acceptance of anything results in people generally in bad things. I'm not saying that science is worse than religion. Absolutely, science is better, but it still has harms associated with it. And what I think, furthermore, if you are an individual that has fundamentally rejected faith, that is entirely, completely atheist, what I say is that becomes much more empowered when we have two sets of ideologies, one of which you are capable of rejecting. At the point at which society has mindlessly accepted one, because that's how it works, if there's only one ideology, people stop questioning. If science is the only thing that people know, the only thing people reference, well then people are a lot less likely to question it. So what I would say is that, as an atheist, your view becomes significantly less empowered and less sort of well-developed when you are not forced to question it all the time. Similarly, for a person of faith, if science continues to question your views or continues to challenge your views, that forces you to form better opinions and to ultimately make your life fundamentally better. I don't particularly think that individuals of faith pose any threat to the rest of society. I think that if you as an individual want to say the creed and want to believe the creed, that's fine. That doesn't affect me, that doesn't affect anyone else. I think hierarchical structures surrounding religion, also hierarchical structures that surround science, have massive problems. Furthermore, if you look at what we now see as being faith and we now see as being science, I would say that science is much more hierarchical in the sense that we as individuals are capable of opting in to some kind of spirituality. Whereas if you want to believe something that's scientific, you have to listen to someone who has a degree in science, who's gone to university between 8 to 12 years. That means that it's inherently less individual and inherently more sort of oppressive, I think. But yeah.
Our next speaker for the proposition is Mr. Michael Nugent.
Thank you very much for inviting me here today, and I'm glad to be here. So the question is, why should we hope that science will kill faith? I think the first reason is that faith corrupts the search for truth about reality. When we apply reason and critical thinking to the evidence of our senses, we can come to beliefs about reality that are most proportionate to the currently best available evidence. And that's really the test that we should use. And the best way of approaching that test is the scientific method, which is essentially that you observe what's happening, you come up with hypotheses, which does involve imagination. You predict what will happen if that hypothesis is correct, and then you test the hypothesis against experiments that are designed to minimize human bias, and based on that, you come up with theories. And as the physicist Richard Feynman put it, it doesn't matter how beautiful your theory is, or it doesn't matter how smart you are, or it doesn't matter how many letters you have after your name. If your theory doesn't fit the evidence, it's wrong. And that is the key difference between science and faith. Science follows the evidence, whereas faith tries to crowbar the evidence into its already reached conclusions, or alternatively just ignores the evidence. Science seeks to gradually move ever closer to the truth, while realising that we will never reach it, whereas faith believes that we have already found the truth. And most crucially, science tries to prove its theories wrong. That's how science advances, by gradually excluding theories that don't fit with the evidence, whereas faith tries to prove its theories right, or at least assumes its theories are right, and ignores anything that tends to prove the opposite. And the significant difference between the scientific method and religion in terms of finding reliable truths about reality is that science works and faith doesn't. Every generation, by using the scientific method, we learn more and more about how the universe operates naturally without supernatural explanations. I'll take the point in a minute. Every generation, the parts that we don't yet understand, religious people of faith, ascribe to gods. And every generation, the bits that gods are responsible for become fewer and fewer and fewer and fewer. So, the Christian God, for example, has gone from a once mighty God that was responsible for creating the universe, flooding the entire planet, impregnating the Virgin in order to give birth to himself, and has now reached the stage where he is reduced to mostly appearing on a piece of toast. And the significance of that is that faith, in an Irish sense anyway, is already dying. You've probably seen that story I wrote from a few months ago that showed that 75% of Irish Roman Catholics don't believe in transubstantiation, which is one of the key elements that distinguishes Catholicism from Protestantism. 50% of Irish Roman Catholics don't believe in hell. 15% of Irish Roman Catholics don't believe that Jesus was the Son of God. And my personal favourite, someone else in the queue, of course, my personal favourite is that 80% of Irish Roman Catholics don't believe in God. I'll take that question down there now. So, did you have a question?
Sorry.
Yeah.
Just previously you were saying that faith doesn't work, but if like a person in themselves find that faith does work for them individually, then it's not a matter of whether science works better than faith, it's what works for the individual.
Things can work for an individual in terms of what an individual wants to do, but in terms of what I'm talking here is in terms of the most reliable ways of identifying the truth about the reality that we all share. And the reality that we all share is best analysed by trying to minimise human bias. The second reason that we should hope that science will kill faith, aside from science being more reliable as a means of investigating reality, is that faith corrupts our natural sense of morality. And I want to say that this happens even if, again I'll take your question in a minute, even if you believe that there is a supreme being that created the universe. There's simply no pathway from that belief to the belief that that being wants us to behave in any particular way. You know, you just can't go from the universe had a beginning, therefore something must have created it, therefore you can't get marriage. There's no link between the ideas. And religious people who believe that there is a supreme God and that supreme God wants us to behave in a good way are simply believing that because they want to believe it. It's just a personal preference. And in order to believe that, you have to dismiss the idea that there's evil in the world, which is easy enough to do because what religious people will say is either it's some sort of a mystery, it's free will, supremely good God needs to get into the option to do evil in order so that we can choose to do good by free will. But the problem is, you can apply that equally strongly to the idea that there's a supremely evil God. And his purpose is that he wants us to do evil. And why is there good in the world? Well, it's a mystery. But he needs to have some sort of good there in order to enable us to have the free will to freely choose to do evil. And they're both equally strong arguments. There's no reason to pick one over the other than personal preference. Well, there's a third argument, in the words of the late great George Parkin, which is what if there's a God and he doesn't give a shit, which seems to fit the evidence better than either of the two that I've given. I'll take that question over there.
How can you so freely say that faith corrupts science when faith can also be defined as complete trust in something, such as, for myself, complete trust in hope. That complete trust, that faith, is what allows me to go on and, you know, keep going and have the hope in a better tomorrow and to, you know, pursue science and scientific enterprise.
Well, I would suggest that there is an illusion that that's what keeps you going. What keeps you going is the neurophysiological processes in your brain. But the idea of a good God is quite significant because if people prefer the idea that there is a good God, that faith is actually morally and practically dangerous because it allows people to justify to themselves either engaging in or supporting immoral behaviour while believing, although it contradicts their normal sense of passion. Is that a minute left? Okay. That it enables them to do good things or to do bad things while believing that they're doing good things because they believe that a supremely good being is ordering them to do so. Whereas our natural morality, which is based on being a product of our brain, essentially, part of the natural evolution of generations of other beings and then humans living together, is based on natural ideas such as compassion and empathy and reciprocity. And there are much more useful ways of both living together and of species evolving and of being caring towards other people than are listening to the imagined revelations of imagined beings. The final point that I want to make is that science does not claim to know everything. In fact, science doesn't claim to know anything. Science is much more humble than faith. Science says that we can gradually come closer and closer to knowing the truth, whereas religion claims to know the truth. And on that basis, that science is our most reliable way of finding out the truth about reality, and that faith corrupts both the search for the truth about reality and also the search for moral behaviour, or the quest for moral behaviour. I would urge you to support the notion that we should hope science will be the death of faith. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Nugent. Our next speaker for the opposition is Tosy Mahapatra. I hope I can talk about it.
Ladies and gentlemen, the late great Bertrand Russell once said, "Doubt is rational, certainty is absurd." And if more people just listen to Bertrand Russell, I wouldn't have to be up here to rant for 7 minutes about this, okay? See, my problem here, as those who would know me, an ardent atheist, like Michael Nugent over there, top lad. So I'm not here to attack science or to defend faith, but really to talk about the discourse that we're having here, much like John did. My problem here, what inspires me to come up here and rant, is the rise of the so-called scientism, the notion that science is a solution to all our problems. So, before we start, just a bit of rebuttal there. Like, Will told us about how it's great not to be in the third world, which, well, check your privilege, Will. I haven't completely bought into the idea of scientism, which is what I'm here to argue to you about. So, what I first want to talk about is how the perceptions of science have changed in the last century, or why this notion of scientism is even a thing, which the proposition deny that it is. But see, after World War II, science left the esoteric domain of university professors in lab coats to the production line. It actually started affecting the way we live and changing the way we live our lives. And the shift was generated by increasing commercial interest in technology in an effort to compete in the new globalized markets. And this intervention by the markets has gone so far as to change our own evaluations of knowledge that now those who satisfy the desires of industry are seen as more knowledgeable and more valuable than those who don't. For example, like doctors and engineers are now figures of inspiration for kids, but those poor Marxo-feminist academics are confined to one measly peer-reviewed journal. So, like, a combination of this, with the fact that the scientific method can be applied to a variety of problems, has given rise to this idea that science is an explanation to the totality of our existence, which is why we're here today, which is why we're having this debate. See, science is now seen in the same sphere of thought as religion. It's not just the scientific method anymore. And I find this clash to be productive because the discrepancy between the two is our only real window to a thorough examination of both. It's the closest we're going to get to a sort of objective viewpoint here. See, religion reveals the limitations of science, and although religion, the authority of it as an authority on our existence, has disintegrated, it is still a massive influence on people, as we have shown on the off, and it informs them of moral questions, whether you like that or not. Like, I don't. But these are questions which science cannot answer. Like, when people like Sam Harris try to answer them, they completely ignore 600 years worth of logic and betray the fundamentals of science. Like, if there was a scientific discovery tomorrow that actually told me that life begins at conception, that's not going to do anything to change my opinion on the morality of abortion while a woman's life is still in danger. Like, these are just, science gives us facts and approximations of truth. It does not give us moral values, right? But this also works the other way, because science also shows the limitations of religion as a faith-based system, not as a rational one. And so we're better off for having this debate, but we're better off for having this discourse. But why am I in opposition today then? And that's because, well, see, I feel that our worldview, no thank you, Will. I feel that our worldview at this stage is quite unique, in that our understanding of reality is no longer centered around these systematic theories of everything, but it's centered around the individual and our interaction with reality instead. Like, religion, like, whether you like it or not, has lost its stranglehold as the authority of our existence. But so the other narratives, such as like Marxism, history, science, we can disagree with them and criticize them, because the conflict between these theories and the contradictions there is, the contradictions they raise allow us to see reality as reality really is. It's ambiguous and it's chaotic. And so why do I hope science is not the death of religion? See, when we talk of science defeating religion, like, what we really talk of is science replacing religion as this authority, as showing religion to be obsolete, and as replacing religion as an alternative. No, thank you, guys. So it's misrepresenting the true nature of our reality as definite, instead of what it really is, which is our own subjective experience superimposed onto this natural disorder, and of science as something more than it really is, which is just a tool. Because that's all science is, which the proposition don't want you to know here. It is a tool. It's a tool which could solve world hunger. It's a tool which could solve the energy crisis, like, within weeks if it wanted to, but instead it builds drones. It has the potential to do good, but it also has the potential to destroy us. And why is the reason for that? Because science is in the hands of humans who are ultimately fallible and self-interested. Like, what we call scientific problems are actually more complex than that. There are also social problems, they're political, and they're also cultural problems. See, so that's why I beg to oppose here. Because by having this debate, we're treating science like a red pill, when really it could just be leading us further down the rabbit hole. I beg to oppose.
Our final speaker this evening for the proposition is Michael Coleman. Mr. Chair, Mr. Auditor, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen of the College Historical Society, ladies and gentlemen. The late great Carl Sagan once described the Earth as a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. We are this and nothing more. Like we are just one planet in a galaxy of billions and billions of stars, in a universe of billions and billions of galaxies. None of it cares for you, none of it cares for me. Everything we do is a mere irrelevance. In the grand scheme of things, nothing any of us do does matter or will ever matter. And yet it does still matter. Everything we do matters because we feel that it matters. Each and every human being has access to some kind of meaning and importance in the range of experiences that they can have and in the range of feeling and emotion that is available to them. Where does faith come into this? Because what I think is that what faith does is that it necessarily limits the scope of experience and feeling that we have access to, and experience and meaning that is open to people. And that is why I think faith must die. Why then, though, is science the vehicle by which religion must die? Religion and faith. Somebody once said that the Enlightenment will be complete when the last king is strangled with the guts of the last priest. Simply put, science has strangled the largest amount of kings with the guts of the most amount of priests. Before I continue, I should stress that that's not a threat to our chair. Right, well, so science, I think, is just the most effective means of killing faith. And before I go on, I should also say, like, I don't advocate like a cold world filled with emotionless robots just doing robotic things. I think that's a straw man and the part of the opposition. Because the fact is, we don't actually know what a post-faith world would look like. We don't know that science is the only thing from which we think about the world. So like, I would contend. But anyway, so like, why is science very effective? What I say is that science, and more specifically the scientific mode of thinking, logical thought, is the most effective tool by which we free people from dogma associated with faith, dogma which necessarily limits their experience. We say that like it was unquestioning faith that told us that women and people of colour, that still tells some people that gay people and trans people are less than human. And how did we actually get over this state of affairs? We say that it was by not trusting in faith and dogma, but by actually rationally analysing the situation and thinking about it. Like, people have talked about logic and science being this cold thing that, like, you know, divorces us from humanity. What I would argue is that scientific thinking and rational thought is one of the things that brings us into touch with the humanity of others by realising that we are all essentially all the same. No, thank you. What I say is that is simply one example of how faith does affect people. Like, it's true that the individual having faith may not affect anyone. But what inevitably happens is that more than one individual, no thank you, has faith in one particular thing. You get groups of individuals having faith in things. And what happens then is norms are created which necessarily limit the experience, no thank you, of groups of people. And that's what happens to oppressed groups. It's because of dogma, no thank you, created by faith, instead of like actual scientific analysis in the system. But like, why is it that faith necessarily limits human experience? Like, not just of groups, but of the individual with that faith too. What I say is, firstly, it tells us that this material world is not like all there is. What I would argue is that, no thank you, the only thing that we know exists is essentially our perception of this world, right? And when we start taking decisions, no thank you, and living our life based upon something else, that necessarily limits the way in which, no thank you, we can experience this because we don't experience it with abandon. We don't abandon our preconceptions and live life full. Michael. What I would also say is that faith requires us to recognise, with almost all varieties of faith, requires us to recognise some sort of like standard before which we are unworthy, like we are inferior. Like, no, thank you. Like obvious examples like Christianity requires us to recognise a God, but even something like Buddhism requires us to admit that we are unworthy, like, well, not unworthy isn't the word, but like sinful and bad because we haven't achieved oneness with the world. And like, I think this is problematic because it tells us there are limits to what we can do and what we can achieve. And I think that necessarily limits the way people think about life and what people want to do. And further from that, it's very easy for others to ascribe a particular meaning from, no thank you, that this unachievable standard by claiming that they have contacted with So what does faith offer us then? What we've heard is the transcendent. What we've heard that faith offers us is the transcendent. That's what Jengel wanted to talk about in his speech. Yet, we have no real idea exactly what we mean when we say transcendent, when we say material. We have no conception of what that actually is. And what I take Jengel to mean when people feel in contact with the transcendent, he's talking about particular kinds of feeling, particular kinds of experience. And because essentially that is all we have. And I think the fatal conceit that Jengel and people who talk about transcendence make is that this is the only way in which we can gain that sort of feeling, that kind of experience. What I'd argue is you can gain it through other means. Like when we talk about something like music, I think he says it cheapens it to ascribe it to a purely physical thing. Like I think it cheapens it to say that it can't be a purely physical thing. I think the fact that it is a purely physical thing, if anything, is something that we can draw even more like joy from. That like in this just physical world we have these experiences. Because I think ultimately like there's nothing more human than to reason and to rationally analyze things. So I think that is something worth celebrating instead of being abandoned in the dark ages of faith and like not actually analysing things. So for all these reasons, I'm proud to propose that.
Our final speaker tonight, the final speaker for the opposition is Ciaran Parkin.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. President, Mr. Alder, ladies and gentlemen of the College of Historical Society. A couple of days ago, when I sat in my room surrounded by handkerchiefs and kind of empty packets of antibiotic, and I received an email from the correspondence secretary asking if I'd like to speak tonight, I thought to myself, what would Jesus do? That's not true, I have no idea what I was thinking. Also, there are some side effects to those antibiotics. Let's hope I can stay in the room for the next 7 minutes. Alright, I'm going to do a few things. First, I'm going to start. The first point kind of this debate, when you think of the motion, is that we hope faith dies, right? We don't just not believe ourselves, we hope that faith dies. So to accept that, you for a start can't have any slight suspicion that that faith is correct. You can't be an agnostic and support this motion. You can't be trying to make your mind up and support this motion. You have to be absolutely convinced that that faith is wrong. Now, just so long as everybody's clear about that, that's almost kind of the basis upon which this debate is based. And so, on that kind of slightly dubious basis, I'm just going to proceed assuming that. So long as everybody's willing to kind of remember that you have to accept that before we go on. So now I'm going to talk about some things that other people said that I found, again, a little bit dubious. For instance, Gavin told us that all religion does is divide people. Is that really all that religion does? As a member of a church in Waterford, what I see that religion, through the Methodist Church and its agents, does is it helps people when people are sick to get through that difficult time. It helps people who are trying to get immigration papers into the country to deal with the legal process. It helps people who are having all kinds of difficulties deal with those difficulties. It provides a community to help those people along. It provides all of these resources to people, and it does it for free because it's subsidized by other richer members of that community. That's another thing that religion does. I would suggest that that's a large part of what religion does, is charitable and generally good things. No, if you look, for instance, at Egypt, before they took power, the Muslim Brotherhood was already running most of the hospitals. Because it's an essential tenet of Islam that you have to provide alms. It's an essential part of many religions to just do good things. And let's remember that that's part of what religion is. Now, I'm not denying that non-religious people can't be good, no thank you, but I'm going to deny the idea that non-religious people being good is somehow better than religious people being good, which seems to be part of what people try to bring out of the proposition side of this debate or similar debates. Secondly, we heard that there are many different religions. We have that Homer Simpson quote. Well, one of the great things that's happening these days in religion and the religious world is the Atheist movement, which is a recognition that while there are many different specific ideas of the religious truth, there is a kind of a core truth behind that. We have different kind of representations of that, thank you, William. And that different religious communities are being able to work together. Also, that doesn't matter, it's fine, that's enough.
Ciaran.
Yeah, go on.
So, if you are going to credit good things done by religious people to religion itself, are you also going to credit the bad things done by religion, such as, oh, I don't know, homophobia, and oh, let me think, misogyny in Saudi Arabia?
Actually, I'm going to come specifically to homophobia in a little while, but yeah, I'm willing to accept that religion has led to bad things happening. I think that on the whole, it's led to more good things happening. I think if we can, no, thank you, we can just do, but I'm also going to, but mainly what I was doing there was attacking this all religions do is statement. But yeah, religion does have to accept bad things, as does science in terms of like the bomb. People have brought up is this one idea that we had from the president and also from William, which is that without religion, what we can do then is all just feel really chuffed about ourselves. Alright, fine. Well, that'll be a nice religion, but also I don't like that kind of attitude. Alright, so our second actual point is one about morality. We've heard from a couple of speakers from Nugent about how morality is possible without religion, and we have other bases for morality. As a philosopher, I actually find it difficult to see other genuine proper bases for morality, because like, what we had here was what's evolutionarily practical. Like, evolution's great, and doing what's evolutionarily, no thank you, kind of successful is also good in ways, except when that's a bad thing, as it often is. Like the other basis I can see for morality is kind of what's obviously true. Like that's actually a large basis of philosophical secular morality ethics these days is saying, well, this is just an obviously bad thing or good thing. It's clear, we all accept that and move on. Well, if that's just really obvious, kind of an absolute base without a rational basis behind it, like, why do we believe that when we can absolutely dismiss theism? No, thank you. Then in relation to that is this idea that it's just morality that comes from religion is somehow inferior to morality that we think through ourselves. Why? Why is it, no thank you, that we haven't had to think it through ourselves, that we haven't had to face that challenge, that's no longer valuable? Certainly it's good to achieve these things, but why do we want to dismiss it for people? Why do we want to make it harder for people to make these decisions? If we think something's good, why do we want to make it harder for other people? Why do we want to force them to go through a difficult process to achieve that? This relates to a kind of an attitude, kind of a generally supercilious attitude that I find is often part of the anti-religious kind of position, which is kind of, that position for a start, but also kind of, oh, well, people use religion as a comfort when they face difficult times or when they're scared of thunder. Comfort's good, right? When an individual's faith allows them to get through the day, an individual's faith allows them to achieve, to succeed for themselves, to deal with loss, that's great. Let's leave that to them. Let's not take that away from them because we don't share that belief. Because we see that there are other bad things that happen in organised religion. We can see that it does good for an individual, and let's let them have that. And finally, I want to talk about the church, and for instance, this is where I get homophobia. I want to talk about the church as an institution which slows down progress. Last year in this society, we had a debate about human genetic manipulation, and one of the speakers arguing against it was a priest. I think that's really valuable, because when you are, for instance, a geneticist, and you're really enthusiastic about the things that your technology is achieving, it's all too easy to think that we have to do it all right now. We have to progress immediately as far as we can down this path. But the church, as an institution completely soaked in tradition, acts as a kind of a stop to that, suggesting we have to stop, think, be careful about the progress that we make. The fact that the Society of Edinburgh was all about this kind of idea. the tradition, the way of tradition, essentially represents the wisdom of the thousands of people who have gone before us. The same thing is true of social progress. So while yes, we should overcome homophobia in the church, and it's happening slowly, especially misogyny, we shouldn't think that we right now at this instant, whatever we think at the moment, have got everything right and everyone who came before us was wrong. We shouldn't think that we have it right when everyone else is somehow just obviously being mistaken. We should take the time to think. You make slow, careful progress, and that's the kind of thing that the church does. I'm thinking here of stuff like the French Revolution. So we're going to end up, first off I'm going to apologise to Professor Berman, who gave a wonderful speech, and I'm so sorry I couldn't engage with it. And then I'm going to relate back to what the auditor said at the beginning, talking about scientism, how it throws everything away and uses only itself at the end. I was reading a textbook for myself by morphology, it's the science of words, and the people who were writing it said that they followed the principle in their science of anything goes. We don't reject anything, we allow all methods and we follow them all, because only then can we have a fully rich system. I follow that. Why should we throw out another option? Why shouldn't we kind of allow different ways of viewing the world? Ladies and gentlemen, anything should go.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've now heard all the speakers on proposition and the opposition, so now I'll put the motion to the floor. I'll repeat it again. It is that this House hopes science will be the death of faith. Can all those in favour say aye? Aye. And all those opposed say nay. Nay.